So, after a 2-week break following the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix, F1 will be headed stateside for a brand new race weekend, as the teams and drivers will be taken to the track at the newly built Miami International Autodrome, which is just a fancy name for the Hard Rock Stadium car park. Coming into the race, Ferrari was still at the top of both the drivers' and the constructors' standings, but after a poor showing in Imola, Red Bull had closed the gap to just 11 points. Aided by the fact that with 10 laps to go, Charles Leclerc decided to yeet his car into the barriers. Further back, with Red Bull picking up as many points as they did, Mercedes were now solidly in 3rd place and Lewis Hamilton was in 7th. Ironically, just 4 points ahead of his old teammate Valtteri Bottas, who was now becoming the anti-Fernando Alonso when it comes to timely career moves. Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to round 5 in Miami. Before we get going, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy and subscribe down below for more F1 content. With a variety of videos, I'm sure there's something you'll enjoy. Now with that out of the way, let's get into my honest review of Formula 1 and the 2022 Miami Grand Prix. So in the run up to the weekend, we got our first look at a nearly completed Miami street track. Well, I say street track, but that would imply it used actual streets, opposed to just building the whole thing from scratch. But I can think of one person that'll be happy with the track design, as because the circuit is built on existing tarmac, it means there's no gravel for Carlos Sainz to go and get stuck in. I guess the track is just the way F1 is nowadays, but the venue itself does look pretty cool as it surrounds the Hard Rock Stadium. And for those less familiar with US sports, it's the home of a pretty bang average NFL team. And to round off this story, an element of the venue that many people were interested to see was the proposed marina section, which would house a number of yachts. But we were all left disappointed to find out that instead of real water, it was just stick-on pictures instead, also leading to Sky Sports' entry into the most what in the world is going on here competition. But the new venue wasn't the only big news, as after years of rumours, it was finally confirmed that Audi and Porsche would be entering F1, with both the Volkswagen-owned companies looking to join when the new regulations come in at the start of the 2026 season. Meaning that after Mercedes got kicked down to the 3rd best F1 team, if they don't get their act together, they may actually end up as the 3rd best Germans in the sport as well. And finally, there was rumour that before the weekend started, both race directors had caught COVID, which had everyone fearing the worst. That was of course the suggestion that Michael Masi would be asked to step in for a race. But luckily it was just rumour, meaning that F1 fans could sleep easy, knowing that he wouldn't be anywhere near the event. Now I said that was the final story, but given my luck is on the same level of Bottas and bad pit stops, F1 dropped more news after I'd already recorded the build-up. And that news was that Drive to Survive had been extended for a further 2 seasons, bringing the total number up to 6. Now I'm all for the series, but it has to be said the latest season didn't go down the best, as over the past few years the rating has dropped off more than LeBron and the Lakers. But you know, it does reach new audiences and provide epic drama, even if the storylines are a bit creative. On to the action, and it wasn't long before someone was clipping the wall, as Max Verstappen ran a little wide out of turn 16. Not wanting to be outdone by his championship rival, Leclerc then went and spun his Ferrari, still not used to the tyres on the new track surface, which was the same for Yuki Tsunoda, who managed to keep his car out the wall after losing the rear out of turn 8. Someone not managing to keep their car out the wall though was Valtteri Bottas, as the Finn channeled his inner Latifi and stuck his car into the barriers, which ended his session and brought out the red flag for the first time. Over at Haas, and it was Mick Schumacher finding himself in the middle of some action. First off was an incident along the back straight, where Daniel Ricciardo decided that accelerating was overrated and slowed up right in front of the German, forcing him to take evasive action in order to avoid running into the back of the McLaren. And if that wasn't enough, he was also getting tangled up with the Ferrari of Carlos Sainz, the two running side by side through the twisty middle of Sector 2. Well, I say it's a twisty part of the circuit, but a more appropriate name would be the worst bit of track that's ever been purpose-built for modern F1, apart from maybe the entire Sochi Autodrome. And then finally, towards the end of the session, it was Carlos Sainz bringing out yellow flags, the Spaniard completing a neat 360 before carrying on. So you remember how I mentioned that Max Verstappen had a light incident just clipping the wall in FP1? Yeah, well, that kinda led to Red Bull changing out the gearbox as a precautionary measure, also meaning that Max was stuck in the garage to begin the session. And joining him in the pit lane was Bottas and his Alfa Romeo, the damage that was caused in the first session proving too big of a job to get fixed, and thus leaving his car up on the jacks in the garage. Well, the front half of his car at least, as the back half and engine were nowhere to be seen, kinda like Manchester City's defence in the late stages of a certain Champions League semi-final. But onto the track and things were happening. First off was Sergio Perez, who, like many other drivers, was finding turn 8 surprisingly tricky, the Mexican not able to correct his oversteer and subsequently performing the year's most slow motion spin, but importantly he kept the car out the wall, which was something that Carlos Sainz couldn't do, as the number 55 Ferrari made a detour into the barriers while on its journey from turn 13 to turn 14, which to my amusement at least took the commentary team by surprise. But to be honest, it shouldn't really, as if the past few race weekends have taught us anything, it's that Carlos is going to be involved in some sort of incident, regardless of if it's his fault or not. But once the debris was cleared, we had cars back on the track, and one of those heading out was Max Verstappen, who was also very quickly headed back in again, with car problems meaning he wasn't able to properly turn the car, along with having overheating and somewhat fiery brakes. And someone getting a bit close to those brakes was Lance Stroll, as with the Red Bull crawling along the racing line, the Canadian narrowly avoided the back of Verstappen's car. But the Dutchman made his way back into the pits, meaning the session could continue. That was until Latifi's Williams had its say. With a reported loose rear tyre, he was forced to pull over, which once again red flagged the session. And then once underway, despite only 5 minutes left, the drivers were keen to keep making mistakes. First off was Sergio Perez, who overshot his braking while practicing overtaking on Sebastian Vettel. Though Checo, if come race day you're having to overtake an Aston Martin, well then your weekend has already gone very wrong. And then rounding out FP2 were a couple of spins, courtesy of Kevin Magnussen and Seb Vettel. But once all the cars were back in the garage, it was surprisingly George Russell leading the times, and with Hamilton in 4th, things were starting to look just a little better for the Mercedes team. Now before getting to Saturday's action, I'd like to take a minute to tell you about today's sponsor, NordVPN. Now if you're anything like me, you're online a lot, and whether you're looking for new clothes, planning a trip, or even browsing for some good F1 content, it would be nice to know that it's only you looking. Well, with NordVPN secure servers, that's exactly how it is. Meaning that when you're online, your data is private, your IP address is hidden so nobody will know your location. Plus, whenever you're connected to public Wi-Fi, NordVPN secures your connection, meaning that hackers can't steal your data and your online traffic is invisible to them. But that's not all, it gets better. You see, one of NordVPN's great features is the ability to access content that's geographically restricted. Let's say you wanted to access the US version of Netflix and gain access to extra movie titles and TV shows. Well, now you can. Or say you wanted to be able to watch the US coverage of Formula 1, you can do that too. Or if you connect to say the Greek servers, you can view for free. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, make sure to check out the link in the description or the pinned comment. And if you're not satisfied, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. So that's nordvpn.com/ontrack, link is in the description and the pinned comment. Now back to the video. Compared to previous sessions, FP3 started off fairly quiet. Well, for everyone not named Esteban Ocon, who, like Carlos Sainz the session earlier, decided to send his car into the barriers out of turn 13, also making his Alpine the second car to find itself out of a session perfectly located right next to the Red Bull advertising. Coincidence? Then a team not having the best of practice sessions was the home favourite Haas F1. Well, home favourite by default, but I guess still true. The first problem was for Kevin Magnussen, who spun out of the last proper corner but with no damage done. Then a little later there was a spot of bother for Mick Schumacher, as a plastic bag had made its way onto the track and into the air intakes of his Haas. Then into the last 30 minutes of practice, and there were a number of almosts. First off was an Aston Martin almost getting out of the way of Max Verstappen, who replied to the incident with the customary angry hand waving. And just a minute later it was Lando Norris, almost crashing into the wall at turn 16, with the Brit just managing to correct his car and avoid a slow slide into the barriers. But someone with an even closer call was Max Verstappen, as he was having issues with the chicane, taking a bit too much curb on the way in, subsequently unsettling the car and sending him towards the wall. But he managed to slam on the brakes just in time and avoid what could have been a costly incident just before qualifying. On to qualifying, and the first story was that after his crash in FP3, Ocon had cracked his chassis, meaning that when it came to quali he wouldn't be able to take part. A bit like the Vegas Golden Knights in the NHL playoffs this year. But once the session was underway, it was the usuals at the top, with the Ferraris and Red Bulls setting the early pace. However, someone not looking on the pace was Lewis Hamilton, who was continuing his trend of struggling to get out of Q1, but with one last attempt he eventually made it through. A couple of drivers not making it through to Q2 though was the Williams pairing of Alex Albon and Nicholas Latifi, as despite all the team's efforts to hype themselves up for the Miami weekend, they were still slower than a 350-pound lineman running a 40-yard dash. And joining them was the Alfa Romeo of Zhou Guanyu, who was caught up in traffic along with the Haas of Kevin Magnussen. Into Q2 and the Red Bulls were setting the pace on their fresh soft tyres. The same couldn't be said for George Russell, who despite multiple attempts was struggling to set a competitive time, and while he did eventually get a marker on the board, it wasn't enough to put him into Q3, as the P2 in FP1 and P1 in FP2 turned out to not really amount to much when it came to setting the fast laps. And someone else struggling was Daniel Ricciardo, but he had one final attempt to set a good lap time. Green sector 1, green sector 2, up on Gasly's time that he needed to get through, all that was left was to put together a solid sector 3. Never mind. On to the final part of qualifying, and the Ferraris were first out, going top of the times of Leclerc just ahead of Sainz. That was until Max Verstappen came along, as the Dutchman jumped both of them to be on provisional pole. And a bit further back, Hamilton was in 6th, and the person in front of him, you guessed it, Valtteri Bottas. And come the second runs, that's how it stayed, with the Finn besting his old team in qualifying for the second straight weekend. But up ahead it was close, with all the teams waiting as long as possible to send their cars out, hoping to take advantage of the track evolution as much as possible. And the Ferraris went first, with Leclerc up on Verstappen in Sector 1 and Sainz even faster, and that continued in the second part of the lap, with both of them over 2/10 up, which meant over the line the Scuderia went first and second in a matter of seconds. But Verstappen still had one attempt to put his car back on pole, and that attempt lasted about 5 corners, as he started to slide around through the fast left-right-left of turns 4, 5 and 6. And that of course left Charles Leclerc on pole with Sainz in behind, the Scuderia locking out the front row ahead of both Red Bulls. Now normally at the start of a race, the cars complete the formation lap and then take to the grid, and they all did this except for the Aston Martins, as the team had somehow managed to cool their fuel to a point where it was too low a temperature to start the race, meaning they both had to have pit lane starts. And if anyone's ever heard of this happening before, please do let me know, because it's a first for me. So with 18 cars now on the grid, the race could start. Leclerc got away well, with Verstappen going around the outside of Sainz at turn 1. A little behind, electing to go up the inside, was Lewis Hamilton, which didn't work, as he had to lock up to avoid Perez, which let Gasly past, and then after a little nudge from Alonso, he got past too. Then after the race settled a little, it was on to lap 7 and we got our first retirement, which surprisingly wasn't a car in the wall but a technical issue for Zhou Guanyu. But back on the track and it was close up at the front, with Verstappen catching Leclerc and then taking the lead with his superior straight line speed. But they weren't the only person making moves, as Sebastian Vettel made a great overtake on Latifi into turn 11. I say great, but it was also Latifi, so I can't imagine he's that hard to pass. Back towards the front, and as the race had started to quieten a little, we got the usual drama caused by Red Bull car issues, with the sensor issue causing Perez to lose power and also leading to a battle on the radio between Checo saying there's an issue and his engineer saying it was fixed. But the Mexican won this "I'm right, you're wrong" argument, as he would be down on power for the rest of the race. Then over the next few laps there wasn't much action, and it was at this point where not much went on that we generally found ourselves waiting for someone to do something. And that something came courtesy of Fernando Alonso, who after being stuck behind Gasly for most of the race decided he'd had enough and tried physically forcing his way past, as he was clearly not happy enough to make contact with one car at turn 1, so he upped that number to 2. And while yeah, he got through, he was also handed a 5-second penalty for being as desperate to overtake as the New York Giants are for a QB that can hold onto the ball. So Alonso carried on okay, but Gasly couldn't, as he was left to sort of limp around for a couple of laps before the team decided to bring the car in. But before they could do that, Pierre and Lando pulled off a stunt almost reminiscent of the Latifi-Stroll crash in qualifying a couple races ago, though this time it was more down to a strange racing incident than, well, driver incompetence. This of course brought out the safety car, which usually brings cars into the pit lane, unless you're Lewis Hamilton, as Mercedes displayed all the decision-making ability of Jameis Winston, asking Lewis if he wanted to box, then Lewis telling them to choose, them saying well if you box this happens, before Hamilton eventually told them to just make a decision. And so they left him out on track when he effectively had a free pit stop behind. After all that, the safety car did come in, and despite a challenge from Perez on fresh tyres to Sainz ahead in third, people stayed mostly where they were. This included Bottas, now ahead of both Hamilton and George Russell. I mean, you couldn't really write the script any better, can you? Well, it turned out you kinda could, as after many years of letting Lewis through, the Finn did the same once again, getting a little wide out of 17, which allowed both Hamilton and Russell an easy pass into 5th and 6th place. I guess at least there was no Valtteri at James this time. But the battles weren't done there, as Leclerc was getting close to the back of Verstappen and a bit behind Perez was right up to Sainz, even making a move into turn 1. I mean, he did completely outbrake himself, but at least he gave it a go. Plus there was no real damage, which couldn't be said for Mick Schumacher and Sebastian Vettel, as while sitting in the points with not long left, the younger German went for a move into turn 1, which it's safe to say didn't really pay off, as they were both left with damaged cars and effectively out of the race, throwing away what could have been Mick's first points in the process. But someone not throwing points away was Max Verstappen, as come the checkered flag he took victory and the fastest lap. And that also meant it was time for Miami does podiums, the Dutchman getting a police escort to the podium, almost running over Christian Horner and his wife in the process. And if you think that was bizarre enough, well, the podium itself made it even more so, with all 3 drivers forced to wear NFL helmets as they came out to receive their trophies. I guess it's just a bit of fun, but I honestly don't know what to say on that one. Anyways, that wraps up this video. Remember, if you haven't already, to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see some more F1 content. But until next time, take care.